Okay. Can everyone hear me? Great, thanks.
Hey, good evening, everybody. It's 6 p.m. We'll give another minute or so. I think a couple people are still trickling in. And I just want to verify, Katie, we are recording and um, being broadcast live on our YouTube page. Heard that. Thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. Good evening. This is the Drone Criteria Virtual Open House hosted by OPRD, the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. My name is Jo Niehaus, and I am a policy advisor for the agency. This is a pretty interesting thing we're doing. It's an external work group public feedback process and an open house to give you an update of what we're seeking feedback on. So it's not like a typical or normal state agency rulemaking process. We're not there yet in terms of the drone takeoff and landing rules. What we're talking about today are criteria that an external work group has come up with. So we'll be giving a little presentation, and then there'll be a Q&A session that follows. So this isn't part of like a public hearing or oral or written testimony type of thing, but I hope we can get some questions answered today, and we will jump into that. But before I dive into the facilitation rules, I just wanted to introduce two of the speakers that will help present today. Katie Gauthier is the Government Relations and Policy Manager, and Guy Rodri is our Valleys Region Director. And we'll have some more introductions of the panelists when we get to the Q&A portion. Facilitation rules, this is just like any other public meeting in that, general public participation rules apply. So please be courteous when we get to the Q&A. Again, for our agenda today, we'll be doing the presentation first, then the questions will be typed in and responded to live. The questions themselves are not feedback, and we'll go over this a little bit later as well. And so if you want to submit your feedback, if you haven't done so or want to add more, you can do so on that website. You can also use that QR code to get there, and we have a form specifically for just the drone feedback. All of this meeting will be recorded and posted, and all of the questions that are answered will also be posted on that website after the meeting tomorrow-ish. And you can also view this meeting over and over again if you'd like. But this is not the one and done for public involvement. So as far as the drone rules are concerned, when rulemaking reopens, there will be formal public commenting, and that public comment period will also include a formal public hearing. And during that public hearing will likely be another presentation that will include the proposed rules and the opportunity to give additional written or oral testimony. So let's get going. This is an overview of the public feedback process and where we've been in just that green right here. Prior to this, in phase one, we had staff and an external work group made up of stakeholders to develop criteria that we could use to help inform the drone takeoff and landing maps and potential rules. So right now, what we're trying to do, we're in this public feedback gathering phase where we can get input on the draft criteria. And we are in the very beginning of this where we're giving the virtual open house and the info session. But the public feedback gathering period has been open since October 23rd, and it'll go all the way until December 29th. So there's plenty of time, and we'll do the review and analysis of the feedback in the beginning of the new year. And when we do that, we'll be pitching the work group the findings, and then they will review that feedback as well, and then make recommendations to the directors. So phase 3 and phase 4 are in question marks, but if the work group makes the recommendations, and then the director decides to resume rulemaking and opens up that official process. Then phase 3 will continue, and then phase 4 will be when the rulemaking process concludes and the commission acts to adopt the new rules. Okay, Katie, can you give us some information on the background here?
Sure. So Joe asked me to cover the background, provide a little context for how we got to where we are today. And it's surprising when you look back how long we've been talking about drones. It starts back 7 years ago when we developed an internal drone use policy and data storage policy, as all state agencies did at the time. And this was done with the help of an external stakeholder committee. And after that policy was developed, then in 2018, we began to look at a visitor policy. As an agency, we were developing this policy to provide guidance for park staff. Drone pilots and hobbyists are often calling to ask where they can operate, and we were looking for some clarity around that. As part of that process, we asked the Department of Justice some specific questions, and they advised us that the agency did not have the authority to go into rulemaking, but needed to do that to provide clarity, and needed to seek legislative approval to allow us to go into rulemaking. So in 2019, we developed a legislative concept and a bill that was introduced in 2021 and passed the legislature, authorizing the agency to write rules guiding the takeoff and landing of drones in state parks. As a short-term measure, existing rules limiting operations are allowed, but they lack the specificity for operators or the clarity for visitors about where drone takeoff and landing can happen. For example, when eagles are nesting at Smith Rock State Park, drone takeoff and landing is prohibited based on existing rules. But user conflict with rock climbers is an area that we often hear about, and an area where a new rule with more clear, consistent rules could be a benefit. After we received legislative approval in 2021, then we began a rule advisory committee to start the rulemaking process. And after an initial round of public comment, then rulemaking was paused in 2022 to develop more extensive criteria to help guide where takeoff and landing was appropriate. And that's where we come into today. You'll hear more about the work group later in the presentation. And it was convened by the director to provide recommendations leading to the public feedback opportunity you have today. Next slide. So a little bit about the legislation that passed in 2021. It authorized the agency to engage in rulemaking, but the legislation really aimed to find a balance. The rule for rulemaking is outlined not to allow drones everywhere or to ban them from state parks and the ocean shore, but it obligates the agency to try to find a balance where we can both protect our resources and to find areas where people can still recreate safely. If there are areas where people can safely take off and land drones without significant harm to public resources and where they can safely recreate, then that's what we want to manage. So that was the intent behind the legislation. And then I will turn it over to Guy to talk more about the work group process.
All right, thanks, Katie, and good evening, everyone. My name is Guy Rodrigue. I was operating as the central resource manager in my relationship to this project, so coordinated with natural resource folks, forestry, wildlife sections within our agency, along with the central work group. So my background is in natural resource management, and I started my career coordinating and managing natural resource management plans, which inevitably morphed into more park operations and management at later points in my career. So kind of looked at this project from multiple perspectives. So when we got started, we knew that we needed to create a diverse work group to help navigate this issue. Obviously, you know, there's a recreational element and there's obviously a natural resource element, specifically in relationship to wildlife, that we knew that was going to be a fairly big component. So we put together a pretty significant group of folks with extensive background in these niche areas, which I'll get into here a little bit more in the process. But when we got started, we wanted to make sure that our goal was clearly defined, which is to create a clear framework that balances the diverse recreational interests of park users while preserving the integrity of our resources as well as public safety. The public feedback goal that you see captured here tonight was just creating a process where we can gather feedback from the public on drone takeoff and landing classification criteria that I'll get into more as we go through this. Next slide, Joe. So when we assembled the work group, we did a couple of things to make sure that we were, pretty open and unbiased as it relates to drone use in state parks. Obviously, it's a fairly passionate circumstance for a variety of reasons. To set some context before we got into creating criteria, it was important that people really had a good understanding of what our current rules and authority looked like and how they operated. So we just kind of highlighted some of the current or existing rules that we have in place that can help govern drone use in state parks, irregardless of other criteria that we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. So OAR 736100020. I'm not going to read all of these, but kind of just outlines the park manager having authority to close certain activities and certain areas of the park for specific reasons. The most important part to note in this particular administrative rule is that word temporarily. So it does allow certain areas to be closed for temporary uses if there is conflict while we go through a process similar to what we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation tonight. The second OAR is about protecting park resources, talking really about noise producing machines, vehicles, or devices or instruments. If they're used in a way that disrupts other park visitor experiences, we have an administrative rule that can help, park staff, park managers respond to those circumstances to mitigate any concerns that we see with visitors or impacts to resources. And then the last OAR that's important to note is more in relationship to visitor behavior, which is essentially stating that visitors can't damage the park, so they can't pick, cut, mutilate, trim, uproot, remove any living vegetation, or harass, disturb, pursue, injure, or kill any wildlife. So regardless of what criteria we develop and how we map where drone takeoff and landing is appropriate or not appropriate in state parks, we already have rules that govern interferences or interactions with wildlife. And next slide. So here's an overview of the work group members. We had Emily Van Wink from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Joe Libzeit from the Portland Audubon, Don Harris from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ed Rutledge, who's a recreational drone pilot and I believe was part of the Rule Advisory Committee. We had Philip Johnson with the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, Richard Smith, who is also another drone recreational pilot, and then Kendri Sugahara, who's the director of the Department of Aviation. So with these members, we're again looking at drone use from a variety of different circumstances just to make sure that it was a balanced conversation. As part of that balanced conversation, one of the things that we thought was important to get established was just a good working understanding of our agency. So we needed to remember that creating drone rules for Oregon Parks and Recreation Department is the goal, not making any assumptions about how it might apply to the National Park Service or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or other state agencies. We have a unique mission to Oregon State Parks, and we need to make sure that our process was a reflection of that mission. So with that, we structured a variety of in-the-park, in-person meetings that crossed 3 geographical regions throughout our system. We didn't get to every eco-region in our state. I believe there's 9, but we wanted to make sure that our conversations and our meetings really reflected as broad of a variety or diversity of environments that we could possibly do that made sense logistically. So we had one meeting at Smith Rock State Park where we brought in the mountain climbing community, rock climbing community, along with several other guest speakers to help us understand, the park operations, including the park manager at Smith Rock. The second meeting was at Silver Falls State Park, where we had tribal government representation along with park operations. And then the last meeting was held at Nehalem Bay, or the focus was really on the ocean shore and the protected areas along the ocean shore. So our very own Laurel Hillman was able to join that conversation along with Charlie Plybon with Surfrider. So before we got into establishing criteria around takeoff and landing areas, we knew that there was going to be some gaps that needed to be filled. And, it was important to know that the criteria that we established is really based on assumptions that everyone's going to be operating their drone in a consistent, safe manner. So we wanted to make sure that there's going to be some language around best practices or responsible recreation. The U.S. Forest Service has some guidelines around responsible recreation of drone use for their properties. So we largely took a lot of that information and kind of retooled it to meet the needs of Oregon State Parks. And it captured some basic information about knowing where to fly, following the FAA rules and guidelines, certainly protecting the wildlife and the environment, fly safely, and stay in control. So these are those things that we really ask all of our visitors to make sure that they understand before recreating in an Oregon State Park with a drone. Okay, so the first thing that we took a look at before getting into the criteria was, we knew that there's going to be areas that we just don't want to allow drones. Those are our prohibited areas. There's going to be areas where, drones are most likely going to be okay for a period of the time, whether that be one day out of the year that it's appropriate, or, a complete off season where we wouldn't be interfering with nesting season, so to speak. So there's going to be some areas where we needed to kind of look at it's okay under these circumstances or at these times of the year. And those are our conditional sites. And then there's areas where just because of the natural resource values or what the park is structured like, the resource value that exists within the park, it's most likely going to be okay to operate a drone year-round without any restrictions. Now, there also is caveats to that. Again, kind of tying back into those best practices and some of the other administrative rules that we already have established. If a bird or an eagle flies into an open green area, we have an expectation that our users will have to understand that they have an obligation or a duty to not interfere with that wildlife. All right, so that kind of gets us to the meat of this process and where we're currently at developing the drone classification criteria. So again, you'll see the three different categories that we've outlined: prohibited, conditional, and open, and the subcategories or criteria that fall within each category. So just kind of reading through the list, areas that pose a negative impact to cultural resources is just a hard no. We can't jeopardize that resource value. It's kind of an interesting criteria in the sense that drones essentially exist in the air, so impacts to cultural resources would be limited to a person walking through a site and most likely foot traffic, or a drone impact with a soil or a standing cultural resource. Overnight campgrounds for a variety of reasons, quiet hours and the expectations that people have while they're camping just seem to make obvious sense. Areas sharing a boundary to federal or state protected areas, explicitly prohibiting drone takeoff and landing. So this is really about working in unison with our federal and state partners. If they are explicitly prohibiting drones on their property, we want to make sure that there isn't any confusion around recreation in those areas, mainly from a perspective of natural resource management. The fourth criteria: areas where drone use creates a hazard or poses risk to another use. I think somebody mentioned the rock climbing at Smith Rock State Park is kind of the most obvious example of where that criteria would apply. The fifth on that list: areas that contain federally protected species that are negatively affected by drones based on current research. So we know that this is going to most likely be an evolving conversation as we learn more about the impacts of drones. But as research becomes available, if we have an understanding that drone use is going to be negatively affecting certain species, those are going to be prohibited sites if they're protected. The sixth on that list is areas that have no recreational access. This is more of an operational consideration. We don't want to encourage park use in an area just to fly a drone if there aren't established trails or parking or amenities that are set up to cater to park visitors. So kind of thinking of the undeveloped properties that we have. And then the last criteria, which came up in our last meeting, is areas under lease from Oregon State Park. So we have a lot of ag leases. Really, we would need to make sure and just do our due diligence that we would have or engage in conversations with those leaseholders to ensure that they either are in support of or against drone use, or if it would interfere with the operations of what that land is being leased for. So those are the areas that were kind of a hard no in terms of how we went through the mapping exercise. The conditional areas, as I said, was really about figuring out if there are a few days out of the year up to the majority of the year where drone use could be permitted based on the impacts to resources. So areas that contain environmental conditions that increase the risk of loss or recovery, really talking about terrain, thinking of the Columbia River Gorge, high wind situations, might not be appropriate to fly there in the wintertime. When there's high wind events on a pretty routine basis. In the summertime, different circumstances might be more appropriate. The second criteria, areas where wildlife concentrate for migration, breeding, nesting, or wintering. So a lot of guidance that comes from the Oregon Conservation Strategy and working closely with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to get their spatial or GIS data so we can have a good understanding of how we could map our properties under that particular principle. Areas sharing a boundary to federally or state protected sites. Areas that contain critical habitat for state or federally protected species that are negatively affected by drones. So similar to the first circumstance, the difference with this one is just taking into account habitat versus known species. And, as we learn more about, where wildlife tends to nest in our properties or just live on an annual basis, we'll be modifying our maps to reflect the difference between those two. And then sites at or exceeding capacity. So some places are just too busy to have drones. Thinking of South Falls at Silver Falls, where there's potentially a drone that could fall right down on top of a trail in the summertime. That's most likely not going to be a safe situation for park users. So that essentially mapped the areas that we did not want to see drones in our state park system because of conflicts with other uses or resources, which leaves essentially any other area that hasn't been defined in one of these two other categories would be left as an open, unpermitted location. So I did want to point out a couple of details here. So the prohibited sites, exceptions still can be made through a special use permitting process. So that's a fairly extensive review for our special use permits that, discussions happen from park managers with natural resource staff to ensure that the request is something that we can truly accommodate without negative impacts to the resources. The conditional sites, we are looking at requiring a day permit to operate a drone in those areas. And the neat feature that we're hopefully going to be moving forward with is being able to limit the number of permits that make sense for a particular size. So if it only makes sense that 2 drones operate in a particular area on any given day, we'd be limiting that location to 2 permits. If it's a larger location with less visitation or less impacts to resources, or the potential for impacts is going to be less, we could potentially expand how many permits are available in those locations. And the green areas are open, permits not necessarily required. We are looking at ways to have drone users still sign off and agree to the best practice information, and that will be factored in during the implementation period of this project. And next slide. And getting back over to Joe to touch base on the maps.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. So we didn't want to give you just the classification criteria because we knew people would want to see what does it look like when they are implemented. However, that pretty comprehensive list that Guy just went over, it's really critical that we do get feedback on those things because they are what will dictate how we create these maps and inform our rulemaking going forward. Excuse me. And so we thought giving a sample of the best representation of the maps would be helpful in trying to make those determinations. Granted, we couldn't do all 250 50 some Oregon State Park maps to do it without, it's not really a chicken or the egg question. We know what needs to come first and then we can go. But just as a sample, we put these together, and we didn't release them with the park names, but it's been fun hearing people guess which ones they are. So we have a map representing the coast. That's actually Nehalem Bay State Park. It has an airstrip with the ocean shores and the coastal campgrounds and equestrian use, et cetera. There's a lot of mixed use there. As you can tell, it's pretty. There's a lot of prohibited areas. There's a little bit of green, and then there's some conditional areas based on the classification criteria right now. The middle map that you see is Willamette Mission. That's from our Valleys region, and that has a lot of equestrian use, disc golf, the Willamette River natural features, and there's nearby ag leases as well. So similar, there's some conditional areas that may have some seasonality to it, a lot of prohibited areas, and just a few places that could be open. The last map we have is Tumalo State Park. Out in our mountain region outside of Bend. So that has a big day use area and a campground with a lot of other unique natural resources and cultural resources. So we again see the majority of our state park areas, especially with the campsites being represented and all the natural resources and cultural resources that we steward, are prohibited. But the geographic representation the geographic representation was key, and that shows a wide array of potential user conflicts, and we just wanted to make sure that we give a pretty good spectrum on that. And oops, sorry, I went backwards. Okay. So why not more maps? I touched on this just a little bit, but we have 254 park properties, 100,000 acres, and we need to know if we're in the right direction with this criteria before we go ahead and start and make all those maps. And if we find out that we weren't going in the right direction, then we would have to go back and redo it all. And unfortunately, we're just not set up for that kind of logistics and our staff resources. So we're really excited to have public involvement at this stage to take the temperature, get some feedback, and make sure that we are headed in the right direction before we embark on the wider rulemaking process, and then the map creations from that as well. And having these like consistent and fair policies in place will help reduce confusion, not just for the drone users, but for visitors who may or may not want to avoid drone use, or other people that are recreating. And also for us as the land managers, having our policies and rules be consistent from park to park is the best way that we can handle management issues. It's also a good way for us to get the communication and education started early on, both again with drone users and other park visitors. And having this classification criteria gets people to get their ears perked and listen as we're talking about where you can take off and land safely and appropriately in our parks. We've also heard, including with why not more maps now, just ban drones altogether, or like don't allow them to fly in state parks at all. Again, just to reiterate, it is only about the takeoff and landing of the drones. The FAA has regulation over flight. So we are doing our darndest to make sure that we are hitting the education and communication piece of this early on, so that people feel more confident as they look at this as a potential way to recreate in our parks, and if they do so, that they're doing it properly. But the maps themselves are not a static thing, and the goal isn't to have comments on them at this point on the specific locations, when we want to have continual feedback on the maps from the public. We want to know, as these maps are done and created, that they work, that we our resource needs are not changing, or they are changing, and how our maps are shifting with them. When Guy gave that breakdown of the classification criteria, he also mentioned seasonality of some of the natural resources that we have in our parks. That could be a huge piece that informs whether or not we have drones in an area or not. And that we also are aware that people are very, that our parks are loved, that people feel a big sense of welcoming and belonging when they come to our parks, and a special sense of stewardship. So as they recreate in our parks, that they have opportunities to give input, maybe in an area where we had said that was open before. Well, maybe there's a new species that we weren't aware of. And in this way, we can continue to engage our visitors with our region resource teams. And we have 2 of our region resource managers represented here today. And they'll be answering questions during the panel, but that they can use that to inform their teams and then make adjustments as we move forward. So this is an ongoing and open-ended conversation about natural resource management and recreation management that we have, which is a great segue into our next slide about adaptive management. This adaptive management statement is included at the end of the best practices sheet that's included with the rest of the materials and the maps on the website. But it's really going to become a larger resource management policy for us as an agency. The way it'll apply for the drone takeoff and landing is that, it's a living document, these maps, and the way that the criteria are reflected in the maps, so that we want to have that long-term collaboration and public involvement with the stakeholders, with visitors, and make sure that there is a commitment to the monitoring and evaluation of these. And we're learning. This is new technology for us, for everybody. But we have a lot of sort of new disruptive innovations in our parks. Drones are only one of them, and they will need updates with the resource changes and needs. And this keeps us flexible in being able to cater to the resources at hand. And so the idea right now is that once the maps are complete, that there'll be a real easy way for people to identify which parks that they want to give some feedback on, and then it'll get back to the region resource manager. So for our next steps and expectations, the feedback process will go on through until the end of December. We realize this has been a long time coming with the rules and drone discussions happening in the agency since 2016. We're going to do our best to quickly analyze that feedback and get the analysis and review back to the work group in early 2024. And once the work group has a chance to review, they will develop recommendations to the OPRD director. And then the director could then resume rulemaking as early as spring 2024. And then a new rulemaking process will start with a rules advisory committee and a public comment period, public hearings. So again, you haven't heard the last of the drones conversation. And then once it gets down to the actual administrative rules and what those proposed rules and that language will be, we'll definitely be reaching out for official comments. Okay, well, thank you for bearing with us throughout that whole presentation. We are now in, I got excited. We are now in the Q&A portion of the night. I just want to introduce our panelists. So we have Laurel Hillman. Laurel is our Ocean Shores Resource Coordinator. And we have Bridget Tinsley. She is our Mountain Region Resource Manager. And Ryan Sparks, he is our Valleys Region Resource Manager. And you already know Guy and Katie and myself. So Katie and I will be looking at the chat here and maybe taking turns asking questions to the panel, and the panel will jump in. And then just to reiterate, we will be posting the questions on the website along with this recording. So let's see if anyone has questions. Okay. First questions is from Dolores. Who will enforce the rules? It's a great question. Jump in, panelists.
So I can take this one. All of our park managers and park rangers have commission authority and can enforce all Oregon administrative rules that relate to state parks. We also have contract agreements with Oregon State Police, as well as a variety of counties throughout the state.
Anne asks, will the proposed park-specific maps be available to review before the next official comment period? I'm going to insert myself on the panel, even though I'm not a panelist. Someone can stop me and answer this question. They will likely not be available for review before the next official comment period. The next official comment period will be when the proposed rules are open for public comment. There won't be maps to accompany those because the maps are not rules, and they are a dynamic, we'll call it a document, but they're a dynamic map, and they will be open to comment on or give feedback on. It won't be like an official process like the rules are. It will be much more open and much more engaging once we have the rules in place and we're able to say definitively this is the direction we're going and the maps are produced. So unfortunately the maps aren't rules, and so they won't be part of the rulemaking comment period. I've got a whole bunch.
Joe, do you want me to answer or ask one to give your voice a chance?
That would be great. Thanks. I'm baiting.
So Dennis is asking about the dynamic maps. Notice having some concerns with areas that are mapped. Will OPRD be making changes to the maps that make wildlife disturbances out of range of small drones? Less than 0.55 pounds. I think his concern is the smaller drones have an impact on wildlife as well.
I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but the criteria and rule would apply regardless of the species or the size of drone.
And maybe I will read the beginning of the question and it may help. It says some of the maps in the green areas in the middle or adjacent to a wildlife disturbance area and concern that the area is too close, the green area is too close to a red area.
Yeah, and in those circumstances, we still have administrative rules if there are disruptions to wildlife.
I think also too, Guy, we could talk about that 2-acre minimum. If there's a green area within a prohibited, within like a red area that's 2 acres or smaller, then that just becomes a red area because it's just 2 acres is not a big enough area to take off and land a drone, and without the reasonable expectation that it will continue to take off and land in such a small area. So you may see some parts where areas that are bigger than 2 acres, we're expecting people to be able to do their drone takeoff and land there. But if it's smaller and it's surrounded by a prohibited area, then that just turns into a prohibited area.
Laurel, go ahead.
I'm guessing which area he was referring to based on the limited availability of oystercatcher habitat in the example maps. And I believe that area was a conditional area, so it's likely that that would be conditional based on the period, so not during seabird nesting season, but I'm happy to have a conversation with folks that are concerned about that specific type of scenario.
So the next question is, parks see 53 million visitors a year and proportionately very few use drones. Do we know how many drone users there are? Do you want to answer?
Not to my knowledge. I don't believe I mean, we have no registration process for drone use within state parks. Sometimes it's captured during a special use permit process, but currently without a way to register through some sort of a process. There's just no way of knowing. We could gather some data in relationship to the SCORP report or drone sales or things like that, but it would be based off a lot of assumptions.
The next question is, my drone is a camera flying platform. Are you considering input from photographers?
Well, we have several members on the work group who are drone photographers as well.
And we would also encourage you to provide your input now. And any input that any of your photography folks have. Will you be reconvening a stakeholder work group to review public feedback and map adjustments?
I can go back to speak on this a little bit. The stakeholder work group will receive the analysis of the feedback, and so they will reconvene. Some of them are on this meeting attending and watching right now. So yes, you will have one more meeting, and the maps will not be I'm going to go back to the question. The map adjustments are not done by the work group. Once the maps are created, then and the feedback that we receive will go to the region resource managers and the region resource teams that have natural resource specialists, cultural resource specialists, and archaeologists, etc. They will review the feedback and compare it with what they're seeing, and that's how it'll be inputted. It's not a won't be having a review process with the work group.
The next actual drone rules seem absent. What are plans for the creation and review of rules that spell out registration permit requirements, including operator, equipment, training, features? Will the stakeholder group be convened to continue this work? Do you want to answer that one, Joe? Or
no, I was gonna say, okay. I think it's a good one for you, Katie.
Yes, I'm happy to answer. So the actual rules will, if once the work group that's been convened makes a recommendation to the director will determine whether to reopen rulemaking, and then a new rule advisory committee will be convened to help with the development of proposed rules, and that will go through a public input or public comment process and development process starting from the beginning. So there will be rules developed through that process once the recommendations are made to the director, if the director determines that we want to reopen rulemaking.
The next question is, what is the criteria for what is and is not a drone? Do you want to answer that too, Katie?
Sure. It will be based on the statutory definition of drone in Oregon revised statutes. And that will be covered in the rulemaking as well.
Tim asked, what counts as how the maps are drawn? The criteria do not indicate how widespread or limited drone use will be. You say that you want continuous feedback, so why not allow for it before the maps are adopted? I think I answered some of this earlier, is logistics of us trying to create 254 maps before we have criteria, and then if the criteria changes, we have to redraw 254 maps. And the continuous feedback is there for people to give the feedback. Once we have the consistent criteria, we can go back to and say it was based off of XYZ. So it's the process is calling for us to be consistent throughout. Anyone want to add to that?
The only thing I'll add on to that is just a recognition that the maps will change as part of the adaptive management process, because resources change, wildlife patterns change. All of those things are going to be an evolution throughout this process, going on for, as long as drones are around, in my opinion. So any static map that's presented today could change easily within 6 months to a year.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we get the classification criteria agreed so that we can create the maps with that consistent approach, and how we plan to manage has to come first. We realize people are really eager to see the maps of their favorite places, and we know that that's a big deal. So we're not hiding existing maps from you. We just need to get this step done so that we can go on to the creation. Joe says it might be easier if you let people provide their question using audio. It would be easier and harder in some ways. So for this process, we're just going to read them out loud. We really appreciate people sending us their questions. Anne says, will OPRD be allowing drone use in every single park? In other words, will you expect to have red, yellow, and green areas in each park?
No. That's an easy one. Some parks, based on the resources, will be completely restricted.
David says, I do not see quality of visitor experience as a criteria for restricting drone use. For example, standing at the base of Latrell Falls and having a drone interfere with the experience. This applies to sound, visual distraction, and the sense of being surrounded by nature without a drone intrusion. I don't think there was a question in there. So we'll move on. There's another one that there isn't really a question in there either. I'm skipping some of these without the questions in there, and we can, if people have specific questions for the Q&A, please put them in there with it as a question. Steve says, how will these rules and regulations be enforced, and what will be the source of funding for this enforcement?
Yeah, similar to the conversation earlier, we have park staff in the majority of the properties that we manage on a daily basis, along with law enforcement. Both of those have dedicated funding.
Tim asked, have you surveyed park users to learn what they desire in terms of drone management?
I think this maybe was addressed with some of the work groups that were done, bringing stakeholders together to understand both the spectrum of the different recreation uses at the park with some of our partners. So drone users and other folks that are not drone users but are sharing the same space. A really important priority for Oregon State Parks as a public agency is to make sure that we are offering that we don't have conflict for different recreation users, and but at the same time, not everybody's recreation use is compatible. So finding the way forward, and that we're doing a lot of diligence around providing and supporting that within reason, and and within capacity.
Thanks, Bridget. Ed asked, we were talking about takeoff and landing area only. The scope is of review. That is the scope of review involved here. To say that a 2-acre plot is too small is a misunderstanding. Most consumer drones can launch and land on the handprint, considerably smaller than 2 acres. Is the 2-acre limit an attempt to regulate actual in-flight activity, which is the jurisdiction of the FAA, or is it somehow related to the takeoff and landing areas? Can you clarify? Thank you.
Part of the rationale for the 2-acre size was just honestly being able to recognize where you are in any given location within a park. If it's too small of a location, just being able to geo-reference on a map is difficult. So needing to be of a certain size so you can just kind of orient yourself within a park.
And this is the kind of feedback that we are looking for. So these questions like this that are highlighting the criteria and the criteria notes, like, yeah, please give us the feedback. What minimum size do you think would be appropriate? You know, if will pilots be able to stay in areas or not? You know, I believe that this came from an FAA recognized community-based organization who provided the minimum recommended sizes. So like I said, this is a new territory for us. We're learning. The technology and the innovation is rapidly ahead of government agencies and regulatory bodies. So we would really love to get this kind of feedback through this process. The next question from Dennis references FAA rules about onboard remote identification ID and location capabilities on all drones over 0.55 pounds. Smaller drones and recreational operators are the most significant violators, but are exempted from ID requirement. Instead, the FAA requires a remote pilot certificate. How will the state's permit or registration process relate to the federal requirement for small drones? Will the state consider summarizing and linking to the FAA rules within its own set of rules as it has for drone guidelines?
I don't know if you want to take a stab at that, Katie, but from my perspective, that's an implementation question, not really relating to the criteria. So that's something that we hadn't spent a whole lot of time discussing until we get closer to implementation of and developing of a permit system.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think we would need to work with Department of Aviation and figure some of that is new. So figuring out how we can work with that would be helpful, but it's not something that we did as part of the criteria. It could be part of the conversation for rulemaking.
Anne asked if this also, does it pertain to Alaska also?
No, this is only for Oregon State Parks. So it would only apply on Oregon State Park lands, not even other public lands in Oregon.
Roland would like to know if this includes radio control model airplanes.
There is the potential that the definition of drones could reach out to cover some types of radio controlled airplanes. So it would depend on how it fits in with the definition of drones.
Anne asked, is there any criteria to assure opportunities for quiet types of recreation, birding, meditating, wildlife watching will be protected?
So that, in my opinion, is starting to get outside the scope of what we have authority to do, knowing that this is really in reference to takeoff and landing areas. Once a drone is in the air, we don't have any jurisdiction in those circumstances. So that's why there's generally not criteria around those opportunities. Also, along with recreation is somewhat subjective. What one person's looking for and their vision of recreation is going to be different. We see that pretty frequently with equestrian users versus mountain biking, for instance. So that's part of the challenge of creating criteria around the recreational experience.
Matthew's asking, will there be any options for long-term use permits for research groups from universities, or will permits always be case by case?
We do have a scientific and research permit. So there's a potential for a long-term permit. However, I don't believe they typically extend beyond 1 year. Bridget, Ryan, and Laurel might have a better answer on that.
Most of the time they're about a year or less, depending on the request. Sometimes they're as short as 1 day. There are a handful, I think, that we've issued over the last 5-10 years, more than a year, but not very frequently, because we like opportunities to check in with researchers to see that they're compliant with their conditions. And that's helpful for reissuance on an annual basis or more frequently.
David's clarifying his earlier question was about visitor experience. And David, I believe that I'll just reference Guy's answer back about recreational uses and potential conflict in recreation, and what some people find enjoyable, some others don't. I'll have to leave that one there.
The other thing to add would be that we don't manage other kinds of noise in recreational conflicts. So it's not an area that we've looked at in other recreational conflicts.
Joe's question is, I think, a continuation of that one. I think the question from that previous person is, why aren't there any criteria regarding park recreation experience? Example of the waterfall interrupting peaceful experience. I think it's the same as we don't have that for other types of recreation.
Recreational conflicts. Another example is, some people want to hike by themselves. Some people hike in groups and talk. Some people hike and listen to music. And while we recognize that that's everybody there is maybe on the same trail or passing, and we've all had that experience, both maybe in our professional roles, but also just as public recreation users. It's that's not something that we're enforcing or regulating, how loud they are when they talk to their friends or they're listening to music, or it's just part of the public land space, I guess, is navigating that and finding places, both times of day and locations where you can have the experience you want, and that we as public landowners provide. We've got 254 park properties. There's hopefully something for everybody.
Tim asks, more than walking, wildlife watching, fishing, swimming, and almost every other form of recreation, drone use has the potential to interfere with other users. How will this be factored into places where drones will be used, and how much will they be permitted? I'm sorry I'm asking the questions right after you give an explanation. Bridget, do you want to highlight one more time?
Yeah, it's a similar response. There's a lot of different recreation uses, and invariably there'll be conflict, and we have rules and regulations to manage that, and we always work towards setting expectations and voluntary compliance, but we also have the responsibility to offer as much reasonable recreation opportunity in our public parks as possible, and the details of that are pretty nuanced, right? And so we're trying to find the criteria that is consistent and enforceable across 254 park properties, and we'll be adjusting and adapting to that by information that we're hearing, feedback from the public. We're constantly monitoring and managing both our recreation resources, natural resources, cultural resources, and so forth. So it's a constant process that we'll be working through and adapting with. And we appreciate the feedback from the public on all of that as well.
And we have Ed with a little FYI into a question. The FAA's CBOs are primarily set up to manage RC fixed wing aircraft, which may need 2 acres to take off and land. Drones do not. It's not a question except to ask whether OPRD recognizes CBO criteria to be 100% applicable to the issue of drone launching and landing zones. I would say that, you know, we're looking to the FAA and the FAA CBOs to give us good guidelines. We're also looking to the our work group and the public and to get feedback on whether or not this criteria classification is going in the right direction. Getting feedback like this is helpful for us to see where we need to explore more. So I encourage this to come in as as feedback for us to look at.
Joe, we had another question about who will be creating the maps, and is the department enlisting outside resources because it is such a large project?
That's a good question. Laurel, do you want to answer that?
As far as I know, we're not enlisting outside resources in the form of staffing, but we are enlisting outside resources in the form of information and data from other agencies, partners like Fish and Wildlife Service, ODFW. We've pulled in a bunch of GIS resources that we know are available. If you have suggestions for resources that we might not be knowledgeable about, we would encourage you to include that in your feedback, written feedback to the agency. I believe the folks that will be working on the maps will include our GIS staff, our region resource teams, which include our natural resource specialists, our archaeologists, myself, ocean shore resource specialists, and park managers. And I'm sure I missed somebody. But as far as I know, and Guy can correct me, that we're not contracting this out in any way that I'm aware of.
We have one more question. Would you consider adding nearby automobile parking as a criteria for allowing drone takeoff and landing? After all, vehicles are noisier, more hazardous, and more intrusive than drones. So if those areas allow parking, they should allow drone takeoff and landing.
I think there's a something slightly different about that. There's a noise thing for sure, but cars are on the ground and not in the air. And so when we talk about bird disturbance, as an example, that's that sort of discrepancy makes a pretty big difference when we talk about kind of what's allowable and what's not allowable and how it affects our natural and cultural resources.
Right, we're not regulating flight, but in terms of the takeoff and landing, it's implied that to take off or land, you're coming in from the air or going into the air. So that is something we have to consider.
Yeah, and we do manage where cars go once they're parked. They're not, you know, they're not driving on the trail. They're not off road. So
if your car is not staying where you parked it, then we have a different issue. And another question, it seems OPRD is considering this as half and half kind of situation, but if the goal is balance, how does OPRD balance the interests of millions of park users who are not drone users versus very likely small number who are drone users? I would say that, you know, the kinds of recreation that we see in parks, people recreate different types of ways. Maybe not the majority of park users are rock climbers, or majority of the park users are mountain bikers, or majority of our park users are equestrians, or the majority of our park users are bird watchers. It's not a majority wins type of situation. We're really looking for a way to keep our public lands available to the public and for people to recreate and enjoy. And we don't know what that balance looks like in terms of who likes to enjoy doing what. We just know that our goal is to make sure that we are being good stewards of the land and the resources that we have, along with allowing access to recreation for public lands. So the numbers question gets complicated, but we're really glad that we have opportunities like this to get input from people who enjoy doing things that we didn't even know people were going to enjoy doing 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Anyone want to add to that? Sorry, I kind of took over on that one. Okay. Holly's asking, I had audio problems for the first part of this meeting. You may have addressed this already. Once these rules are in effect, how can they be updated as conditions change, etc.? Katie, do you want to talk about the rules versus the maps?
Sure. So the rules, once we implement, when we go through the rulemaking process, the rules would take an official rulemaking process to be updated, to make any changes. But the maps, when we go through the adaptive management policy, and the maps will be an ongoing updating process. Guy had explained that adaptive management and the continual feedback, or actually I think Joe explained that piece, the continual feedback on the maps themselves. So the rules will inform how the maps are developed, and then the maps will be an ongoing continual feedback updating as situations change. So the rules themselves won't change, but the maps will change. And since you said that the audio was an issue in the beginning, just to reiterate, we will post the full meeting on our website so that you can go back and listen to the beginning.
Okay, we're at 7 minutes after 7 right now. Any last questions before we conclude?
Joe, while we're giving people a moment, I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank the members of the work group. This is a very challenging subject to work through, with pretty polarized views in terms of finding that balance between drone recreation and specifically wildlife management. So thanks to those that were part of that process and will continue to be a part of that process as we flesh out any remaining details.
Yeah, thanks for that, Guy. We do have a couple more questions coming in. Anne asked, why can't OPRD show maps after the criteria are finalized and before the rulemaking process? I'm going to answer this one. It's probably because we're not going to have any maps. Well, first of all, the criteria aren't finalized after this feedback process. It's then going to go into the rulemaking process, and the maps won't be created in the in-between time. If we did that, that'd take a long time. But we're going to be releasing maps after we finish our rulemaking process as a whole. And let me clarify. So the rules will then make the criteria official so that we can follow them. And in that rulemaking process, there'll be opportunities again to address the actual administrative rule that dictates what we're doing. I think they're just, I haven't done a great job of distinguishing the difference between what the maps are, what the criteria are, and what rules look like. So we don't have the rule language yet. Ed asked if the maps will be an ongoing process, updating and serve as a regulatory advisory. How will OPRD provide notice to drone pilots as to the updates? Thank you. That's a great question. Guy, you didn't look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that's probably something that we'll have to discuss during implementation. I think there's a couple of different things that have been discussed. For conditional areas, it would be as simple as just removing permits until maps could be updated, but ultimately we would be updating the maps as soon as we possibly could.
Right, and there's the expectation to check maps before flight. I think we had also even talked about making sure that they're in alignment with common apps people use for flight. So that's definitely still kind of a question mark towards the implementation process, but a valuable one. So thank you for raising that. Diane asked, where will the maps be published once this process is completed? That's another great question. It'll be on the same web page where all of the updates are going right now, and we'll probably make a more front-facing web page too, so that it's easy to find on the larger park maps, and then link out from the park pages so that people can also go from the park pages to the maps. That's an implementation question. We haven't quite tackled that yet, but it'll be very easy to find. Dennis didn't ask a question, but did say thank you, so I'll read that out loud. Thanks to all that are working on this. Yes, thank you to the work group, to the panelists today, and our speakers. We have one last question from Tim. Have you surveyed potential impacts? Have you surveyed potential or documented impacts of drones to wildlife? Synthesize information about those impacts from other sources.
I can take a stab at this one. So we worked very closely with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife regarding drone impacts in those particular areas. So if it's specifically a wildlife question, that was done in consultation through our subject matter experts on the wildlife side. Surveying potential and documented impacts of drones to wildlife, that's something that we do on a informal but ongoing and fairly routine basis with our internal staff.
Thank you, Guy. And a couple more thanks rolling in from everybody. Okay, it is 12 after 7. I'm going to close the Q&A. We have answered 36, probably closer to 30 different questions. And like I said, we will publish those questions along with the recording of this meeting. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate getting this chance to share with you where we are in this process. We know that people are eager for us to move forward and figure out a good, consistent way to apply these rules, and once we get into rulemaking. I am going to go drink some tea now. Thank you very much to our staff and to the work group and to the attendees.